When working in community mental health, it is easy to get overwhelmed by the multitude of processes and paperwork that we're required to complete with our consumers. Sometimes the heart of the process is lost in the demand to keep up with our mandates, and we concentrate on getting things done versus really focusing on the process at hand. In this workshop, we are going to look at both the philosophy and the processes involved in person-centered planning. If you stay focused on the philosophy and intent of person-centered planning, the steps in the person-centered planning process will follow easily in your practice. There are 5 basic philosophical principles that guide person-centered planning. The first is that all people are capable of making choices, regardless of mental health diagnoses or developmental disabilities. Our job as service providers is to give people information about options to ensure that they make informed choices. When making choices and implementing decisions, it is important to use the person's current circle of support. We are also responsible for making sure that any possible health and safety concerns regarding choices are discussed with the person. And ultimately, we are to honor that person's choices. These principles will be examined in more detail throughout this workshop. You might wonder why we are mandated to provide a person-centered planning process. This requires looking at the history of support within community mental health available to persons with mental health issues or developmental disabilities. Originally, community mental health centers were designed to provide services to persons in an effort to deinstitutionalize people who were once served by state hospitals and institutions. Thus, a service system that provided psychiatric medication, case management, and therapy was designed for persons to receive outpatient services. Supports were put in place to help people to live in community living settings versus residential treatment centers. But the original set of services offered were pretty much driven by the professionals, with physicians, social workers, psychologists, and nurses making decisions about the person's care. This model of care was professionally driven, with the consumer's best interest at heart, but with minimal input and decision-making by the consumers. As community mental health has moved toward a more recovery-based model, we have had to challenge our old ways of doing business. Recovery models state that consumers hold the key to their own individual recovery paths, and it is our job as professionals to assist and facilitate, not to direct. In essence, this is a human rights issue. Advocates for persons with developmental disabilities and mental health concerns argued that they should have more control and say-so over their own lives, just like the rest of the population. In 1995, the Michigan Mental Health Code established the right for all individuals to have an individual service plan developed through the person-centered planning process. The goal of person-centered planning is to help people obtain what they want and need. Let's review the definition of person-centered planning found in the Michigan Mental Health Code. Person-centered planning is a process for planning and supporting the individual receiving services that builds upon the individual's capacity to engage in activities that promote community life and that honors preferences, choices, and abilities. The person-centered planning process involves families, friends, and professionals as the individual desires or requests. As we take a more in-depth look at this definition, you will see that the core principles of person-centered planning are included. First, this is a process for planning and supporting the consumer. Sometimes service providers see the person-centered planning process as a once-a-year event. Actually, it is a whole new way of doing business. Whenever you meet with a consumer, you should work on eliciting their thoughts, feelings, and inputs on all decisions, not just once a year. This requires understanding the way in which each individual consumer communicates, whether they are verbally expressive or communicate primarily via behaviors. It requires a lot of listening. Person-centered planning builds upon a person's capacity to engage in community life. There used to be a standard goal that showed up on people's treatment plans that said, "The person will remain in the community." This goal meant that the person would avoid hospitalization or residential treatment. In a recovery-focused model, we do not feel that remaining in the community is enough. It is vital that the person be engaged in the community. Not only does the consumer have much to gain from community life, but everyone in the community benefits from that person's relationships to people in the community. Due to the stigma and challenges of mental illness and developmental disability, consumers often feel isolated from others. Identifying with a community provides a sense of belonging, purpose, and well-being. Person-centered planning honors the person's preferences, choices, and abilities. In traditional treatment planning, we focused on the person's deficits and developed goals to address each deficit. In person-centered planning, we elicit input from the person to find out what they like to do, how they want to live, and then help them to make it happen. It is designed to give people as much control as possible over their own lives. Sometimes, service providers feel uncomfortable with the choices consumers make and, in a well-meaning way, want to protect the individual from making bad choices. Although we mean well by trying to prevent potentially painful consequences, inadvertently we deny the person the opportunity to make choices, take risks, have successes, and learn from mistakes. Encouraging people to make their own choices and to learn from both positive and negative experiences is more profound and life-changing than well-meaning advice from others. It is up to the service provider to make sure that there are conversations specifically to the person's health, welfare, and safety in the person-centered planning process. If an issue arises that presents a safety concern, be sure to address the topic in a direct and sensitive manner. This might happen in either a group meeting or an individual meeting with the consumer. But health and safety concerns must always remain a top priority in the planning process. Person-centered planning involves family, friends, and supports as the person desires or requests. When you involve people who the person identifies as allies, you increase the possibility for positive change. The person may wish to involve allies from a variety of roles, including family, friends, neighbors, co-workers, members of religious or community groups, and paid or unpaid support people, among others. These people can help the person to visualize their hopes and dreams and provide practical assistance to make sure that actions happen to support that person. Now that we have reviewed the core principles and the Michigan Mental Health Code definition of person-centered planning, let's look at the specifics of how to facilitate the process. There are two distinct processes involved in person-centered planning: the pre-planning meeting and the person-centered planning meeting.